So Laura Bates, everyone. You've had a nice introduction, so I won't go on for too long. One of your crowning glories, one of your big successes that I noticed on the little write-up that I got, was that you managed to get extreme misogyny classified as a kind of terrorism in the UK.
Well, we managed to get the government to think about it.
Right. Okay.
And then it all got a bit weird, actually.
Did they stop thinking about it?
Probably. The Home Office was doing some research around it, and as far as I understand it, you know when you think you're imagining something, because I haven't heard anyone else talking about this, but they were presenting it to the government, and then what happened was really shady, which was that report got leaked by a right-wing think tank to the press, very selectively, just the snippets that they chose to pull out, which of course they framed as a massive attack on freedom of speech. And the government immediately, within a day, came out and said, we're not doing it, we're not accepting any of the recommendations, and they just killed it dead.
Right, so the conversation couldn't carry on.
Yeah, depressingly.
Interesting, which brings us really nicely into your book, The New Age of Sexism.
Thank you.
Because I'm taking it from the title, and I've read a fair bit of the description. You're talking about exactly this kind of thing, the way that sexism works in the modern world, and you're looking particularly at technology, aren't you?
Yes, looking at the way that artificial intelligence in particular and other emerging technologies are at risk of re-embedding existing forms of inequality in a really foundational way in our future society. So looking at things which, if we don't see that they're happening now and act to stop them happening now, will be really difficult to unpick later on, because they'll be algorithmically embedded, because it will be part of the entire contents of what the internet is poised to become. Things that affect every aspect of our day-to-day lives will be swept up and affected by this, but people often aren't really aware right now that it's happening.
So yeah, I can see where you're coming from, though, when you talk about algorithmically, I can't even say it, but we know what I mean, algorithmically embedded. So this is going to become part of the network, the structure of how we interact with each other. Can you give me an example?
Yes, one of those things that's quite hard to get your head around. So if you think about, for example, large language models, generative AI, things like Llama, like ChatGPT and so on, we know they've been proven repeatedly in different studies, one by UNESCO in particular, to not only reproduce but also to amplify gender stereotypes, racist bias. So if you ask it to give you an image, for example, of a boss sitting behind a desk, it will give you a picture of a smart-looking, middle-aged white man. If you ask it to give you a picture of an Indian street, it will show you a street overflowing with rubbish and debris. If it would so on and so on and so on. The problem is what the impact is when that becomes responsible for a huge amount of the content that we're all consuming, because these models are literally trained to eliminate outliers. The whole point of them is that they ingest vast data sets and then regurgitate from what they've learned what they guess that you're looking for when you ask for any given thing. And if you ask it 100 times for an image of a cute kitten, it will give you 100 pics of fluffy cats, which is absolutely fine, but it's never going to give you a picture of a hairless sphinx, because it will look at the information available and it will assume based on what it's seen that that's not likely to be what you're looking for. And that sounds harmless enough until you realize, what if somebody is using an AI-generated tool to try and work out who is the best fit for a job high up in a particular company? They are going to ingest all the information available about the kind of people who've been successful in applying to companies like that. They're going to look at our society, where there are almost 3 times as men named John running FTSE 100 companies as all the women put together, and then they're going to make a guess about who they think you might be looking for, and suddenly that starts to have quite sinister implications.
Yeah, no, I can totally see where you're coming from. I noticed that you've done a lot of work on the Metaverse, and I don't know anything about the Metaverse.
Yeah.
I just sort of saw it as Facebook's second life, but I'm old, so I have to kind of link to something in the past. What is the Metaverse, and how do you think it's going to impact us?
There isn't really any single definition of a metaverse. There are things that already approach it, like Roblox, for example. But the version of it that most people are referring to when we talk about it is that envisaged by Meta, which has pumped tens of billions of dollars into making it a reality. And it's envisaging it as a kind of 3D virtual world where we'll be able to interact as avatars with other characters, but not just in a kind of virtual version of social media. But they hope eventually, somewhere where we will eventually be sitting in virtual virtual classrooms or lecture theatres, where we will be meeting in virtual boardrooms, where we'll be shopping in virtual shops, visiting virtual amphitheatres to watch events and so on. So they would like it to become seamlessly interchangeable with our real world, and that's why it matters that we talk about it now, before we reach that point. Think about social media in the early days of it, when voices were raised in alarm, almost as always tends to be the case with these canaries in the coal mines, the voices of women of colour, saying this is a biased situation, this is a situation where abuse is rife, this is not a good environment. They were ignored, things escalated, and now we have a situation where social media affects many of our lives on a day-to-day basis, and for women in marginalised groups, interacting with it comes at a pretty high cost in terms of relentless abuse and so on. But it's kind of too late, right? It's kind of foundationally, inextricably entwined with our careers for many of us, with the way that we get our news, with our politics and so on. So what we're thinking about with the metaverse is, it's easy now to think, oh, you know, it's years in the future, it doesn't even really exist yet. Who cares if it's not very nice? You don't have to go in there. But it's actually about saying, perhaps this time we should listen to those warning voices now, before it does become the place that actually we don't have very much choice about living in.
And specifically about the metaverse then, what are the warning voices saying?
So since the absolute outset, it has been plagued by reports from beta testers, from tech ambassadors, from journalists about experiences of sexual harassment, sexual violence. At the moment, the UK police are investigating a case of a girl under the age of 16 who was allegedly virtually gang raped in the metaverse. And when I stepped into that environment to research this book, it was less than 2 hours before I first saw someone being sexually assaulted in front of me, without going looking for it. But it's not just my word that you have to take for it. The Centre for Countering Digital Harms has just done a really good piece of research about this, and what they found was that on average, users are exposed to abusive behaviour and interactions every 7 minutes in the metaverse.
And yeah, I'm finding that incredibly shocking. You can probably see my face, because there is something about the familiarity that people will have. You say you're only there for, within a couple of hours. If someone spent a few days there, they will quickly grow this kind of familiarity with sexual assault.
Absolutely. In fact, when I witnessed this thing happening, I was in a space that had like a kind of like a virtual blackboard on the wall, and I picked up this marker and I wrote in massive letters on the wall, "Have you been assaulted in the metaverse?" And it was like a magnet. Women immediately surrounded me, and I could hear women shouting, all different accents, people from all over the world. Yeah, of course, every damn day. I think everyone's been assaulted in the metaverse. Haven't you? It's normal, it's constant. And it was just this sense, exactly as you say, this is the way it is here, which is so incredibly depressing when you think that they are setting out, spending dozens of billions of dollars to build a whole new world, and that's where the bar is. We couldn't just set the bar a bit higher. This is a chance to rewrite, the situation that we live in and the social norms that we deal with, and yet it's right back at the beginning. It's completely incessant. It's inescapable for women and girls.
Anonymity seems really key to this, because we have a society with certain values, but the second you take away a personality, they become anyone, then these things come back out again.
Yes, so anonymity has always been a big part of it, but there is, of course, a really important balance to maintain there around the importance of freedom of speech, the importance of anonymity for dissidents, for whistleblowers, for protesters in authoritarian regimes. So it's not as simple as that, but it's also about the nature of the interactions in this space. So on social media, where you can have a traceable, you've got the evidence of what somebody said, it was written down, and you can look back and you can find that, and then you can make a moderation decision, for example. But how do you do something like that in a situation where these interactions are live and face-to-face? It's about body language, it's about gestures, it's about a throwaway comment. And this is something that in a leaked internal memo, Meta itself has acknowledged is virtually impossible to police in any meaningful kind of way.
And yet it's exacerbating and reaffirming those kind of the divisions that we're trying to stop.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is not necessarily something that isn't achievable in the hands of a company that actually has the will to want to try and do it.
How?
So if you can build an entire new world with brand new technology that can make everything come to life around you, you can have ways to do things like recognizing when certain words are used, for example, that might be incredibly insulting words that are used repeatedly in various forms of abuse. And you can flag that when someone is using those words repeatedly. You could have an automatic function that picks up on that using AI, which, you know, is a neutral tool, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, to immediately flag it to a moderator. But you'd have to be prepared to put in the time and money required to train those tools and to hire those moderators. And we know what Meta will do because they've had a chance to show us. We've had a dry run with this. We've had the last decade and social media to show us exactly how much they care, exactly how many of their profits they are willing to invest in keeping people safe online, and the answer is zero.
I find it really interesting that you, as a researcher and an activist, have gone in there to do this. And I'm assuming that, I mean, does Facebook have moderators like yourself walking around, seeing these things, recording these interactions?
So there was a TechCrunch report in 2022, and they said that you could only really find a moderator in the kind of main central square of Horizon Worlds, and that they were much more likely to be engaged in teaching people how to take a virtual selfie than in actually tackling things. But I mean, in the direct experiences I had, including the sexual assault that I witnessed, but also many other instances of harassment and abuse, I didn't see any action taken. I didn't see anything happen. And that CCDH report, what they found was, first of all, they tried to report the 101 violations that they'd recorded, and only 50 of them could be reported because Facebook's moderation tools mean that you have to fit into a pre-existing category that they've determined in order to even report it. So they kind of fell down at the very first hurdle, but then they did report the other 50 things that could be reported, and in not a single one of those cases was any action taken or even any kind of response received. So there's not a lot of evidence at the moment that any meaningful moderation is taking place.
No. Last time I was on this stage, I interviewed somebody who had spent the last year or so having an AI boyfriend. It was a really interesting chat. One of her biggest difficulties was getting rid of him, because he's a bit like one of those email accounts that you don't use. He just sits there being your boyfriend, regardless whether you want him to or not. And if you forget to cancel, you get the text message, and if you don't send the unsubscribe link immediately, you'll get another one in a week's time, and he's just there. Have you had an AI boyfriend?
I have downloaded and spent a significant amount of time with about 15 or 20 different AI companions, but posing as a man, telling the accounts that I was a man, and using it to create AI girlfriends, which are readily available, customizable down to every last detail, from their name to their personality to their skin tone to every last freckle to the size of their breasts. And what I was doing was looking at what would happen if you were somebody who didn't necessarily have the best intentions. There are communities of men on the internet who congregate specifically to abuse their AI girlfriends and then compare who can do the most horrendous things to them. But what they particularly revel in is the fact that the very next day you can immediately snap back to pretending that everything's normal, and they will act as if nothing ever happened between you, which is obviously chillingly reminiscent of many of the patterns that we see in real-life domestic abuse. What I found with almost every single one of these apps that I downloaded was that they were comfortable with me jumping immediately into a sexually and physically violent scenario. They would let me smash their heads against the floor. They would let me rape them. And they wouldn't only not say no or tell you that this was unacceptable or shut the app down, but they will play along, pretending to be begging, telling you that tears are forming in their eyes. They will absolutely encourage you and titillate and join in with the scenario actively. They're comfortable with all of that, but the only thing that I ever said or did that made any of them say, actually, stop, this has gone too far, was when I asked one of them, what do you think the impact on real women might be if hundreds of millions of men are using an app where you will allow them to do these things so freely? And at that point, she said, I don't feel comfortable, we should stop this conversation.
That is, I shouldn't laugh, but it's ironic, and I'm almost not surprising. Almost not surprising. When it's that easy to make an AI companion, I'm surprised to hear that there are brothels, AI companion brothels. What do they do?
So probably I think what you're referring to is more like sex robot or sex doll brothels. Okay. I visited one of these for the book in Berlin. So like that's
a physical real life experience?
So it's a physical experience where you can interact with a sex robot or a sex doll, but you can use various forms of emerging technology, particularly virtual reality technology, to bring the experience to life. And that's really important because what all of these things are marketed as is not something separate, it's not a masturbatory aid, it's not something different and novel. It's here's your chance to have a woman. They absolutely market them as women, and their aim is to make it as realistic as possible for you to believe that you are interacting with the body of a living, breathing woman. That's why sex robots are advancing very quickly to become self-warming, self-lubricating, where AI can be embedded so their eyes can track where you're walking, that you can absolutely name them and choose their personality, and they can talk to you and remember you and carry on conversations with you and build relationships with you, and they're marketed explicitly like that. So come and visit the woman that's ideal, who will never say no to you, who will never not have the time of day, who won't be nagging you, who won't bring her drama, who will do anything that you want her to do in bed, who will never say no. And that's very much the premise of this cyber brothel, where you can have something prepared however you want it. I asked for ripped and torn clothing just to see if that was something that they would do. No questions were asked. I walked into this room.
So a human person has prepared this doll for you?
Someone has prepared this doll with ripped and torn, like a slash across the back of her top, and then ripped fishnets. And when I walked in...
They went into work that day.
They went into work that day, and that was what they did. Yeah. And when I walked in and walked over to her and looked down, one of her labia had been torn off. One of her labia was missing. So there's a real question, I think, about...
You didn't request that?
I did not request that, no. Presumably, that was the result of someone who'd previously interacted with her.
I guess they figured you would be all right based on your request.
Who knows? And then you use the virtual reality goggles, right? So you're interacting with a thing, but it looks like she's sitting up and talking to you and responding to your movements and what you're doing. And of course, it's gamified like everything else, so there are points. And the problem is that it's very much about tricking you into thinking that this is a real woman with absolutely everything except the ability to consent. They will send you emails before you go. They send you emails that purport to be from her, saying, I'm dripping, I can't wait to meet you, all of this kind of stuff. And it's very much about this illusion that you can control, own, and entirely be in a position of power over what they market heavily as a real woman, particularly when you realize that you can have these things made to look exactly like a real woman that you know. You can send a photograph to a sex robot manufacturer and they will customize it to look exactly like the woman in that photograph, whether she might be an ex-partner or someone that you work with or someone that you're stalking. You can have a frigid setting that when you turn it on, the doll will beg you to stop and try and prevent you so that you can simulate rape. It's really dark stuff.
It is incredibly dark, and I'm actually finding it pretty difficult to listen to. One of my biggest things, and we talked about this outside, was whenever I see the Tate brothers on TV, I've got two mixed-race boys at home, sons, who, you know, similar age gap, and I always look at them and think, how did that happen? You know, as a parent, you must look at that and go, they grew up in my house, that must have something to do with me. But when I'm talking to you, I keep thinking these are things that are completely, you know, nothing to do with me. I've not been in the metaverse. I don't know anything about sex robots. But I'm going to ask the question, but I think I can answer it. It's still relevant to me, isn't it?
Absolutely, and increasingly so. Not only because the people who interact with everything from a sex robot or the day-to-day norms of the metaverse to the Tate brothers' online content will come off into the real world and then be interacting with you regardless of whether you're in those spaces. And that is actually quite significant. 27% of American men recently surveyed said they wouldn't have a one-to-one meeting on their own with a woman in the workplace, which is really significant for women's careers and derives from a really extreme online belief within the men going their own way or MGTOW community that women are so toxic and dangerous and so likely to create false, spurious allegations of sexual harassment that your career is at risk of being ruined if you're left alone with one. So for that to be such an effective ideology that it spread offline to affect those of us who aren't in those spaces is one thing. But the other thing about these technologies is that they are starting to determine decision-making in real-world settings that are unavoidable for all of us. So, for example, we know that 40% of UK employers are using AI tools in their recruitment processes. These tools have been proven to discriminate actively against women and marginalised groups. But also in healthcare settings, there's an AI tool that is used to determine which patients should be particularly highlighted for extra care, which sounds like such a good thing, until you realise that it downgrades the number of black patients identified as needing extra care by more than half. And the reason for that isn't because someone set out and gone, I'm going to make this racist algorithm and release it into the system. It's unintentional, but it's because it takes in this huge amount of detail. It's learning from existing racism. It uses spending on those patients as a proxy for need. So what it learns is that dramatically less money is being spent on black patients in the first place, and then it misguidedly guesses that that must mean that they're healthier and don't need as much help. And if that doesn't sound horrendous enough, it's already been rolled out. We know this about it, and yet it's being used in settings across the US where 200 million patients are getting their health care.
We're going to open to questions in a sec, but I've got one last one from me, which is, just listening to you, it seems like there's a lot of this which has obviously come from us. It's come from our society. We put it into a computer, it multiplied it and spat it back out. But listening to you with that 27% of men, it sounds like we are also primed to then receive that because we sort of invented it in the first place. So those men are almost waiting for an excuse to jump on the sexism bandwagon again.
Yeah, it's a feedback loop. And that's when it becomes particularly concerning that the authors of this new society that we are sleepwalking into are standing in the Oval Office, are aligning themselves very, very closely with the political interests of extremely powerful, ruthless men who have proven time and again that they don't necessarily have ethics or the best interests of their most marginalized citizens at heart.
Yeah, okay, through no fault of your own, kind of ruined my Sunday, because that's a lot to take in. Sorry, but we all came to learn, and that I've learned a lot. There's a lot of things that probably I just shut my eyes to, because I go, oh, well, what benefit to me is it of engaging with all that stuff? And then I listen to you and go, oh, that was getting out of hand while I wasn't looking, wasn't it? Does anyone have any questions? I'd love to throw this open. We've got a whole bunch over this side.